about it, I don't want to see anything.
You know, it's far better that way. It's just far better that way.
Yeah, I go a long way back in planning, and you know how planners are. But
Maybe they don't.
Gayla's in charge of this project, and she's going to introduce these young fellows here who are working on this project.
Thank you.
Gail, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, indeed. I'm an urban planner, but right now I am an adjunct lecturer, adjunct instructor at the University of Florida. There is a project. It's about a 2-year project funded by the Sea Grant and conducted by the University of Florida under the leadership of Dr. Catherine Frank, who is teaching a class, and so she could not be here at this particular time, to look at coastal change in the Big Bend area, specifically Levy County. And so tonight, this afternoon, what we would like to do is tell you a little bit about our project and talk a little bit about sea level rise, which is an integral part of what we're studying there. The project is about a third of the way through. It will go until the end of next year. And one of the key activities is talking to citizens about the issues and finding out what is of particular concern, what kinds of information that you might want, and you'll hear more about that as the project goes on. 4 of the students, it's a graduate level studio class that is addressing this issue of public participation. 4 of the students are with me here tonight. Kevin Bennett, who's a PhD student in our program. Juan Castillo, who is taking video and photographs and recording the whole activity, is a graduate master's student in our class. And our 2 presenters are Sean Reese and Kevin Satsmari, and they will introduce themselves further when we get started. So our presentation is about 17, 18 minutes, something like that, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions and for you to come up and look at some of the maps we brought in closer detail. So I will sit down and take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kevin Zatmary. Sean Rice, this is my colleague here. We're here today to talk to you all about coastal change in Levy County. As y'all probably know, the coast is instrumental in attracting visitors to this state, especially this county. People come here for recreation, to go fishing, just go to the beach, to just take in all of the nature that's right here in this area. And obviously people come here to do business as well. So as we move into the future and we plan for the future, what we need to do is take into account what's going on today, what changes are going on right now. So why are we here? We are here to discuss the impacts of coastal change with y'all, and discuss the implications of sea level rise and what that's going to mean for y'all in the future. We want to hear from you towards the end of the presentation. We'll have time for some questions and discussions and how y'all feel about what we're going to discuss with you guys. So first, our agenda, we're going to talk about different types of coastal change, what they mean, and some different types. We're going to talk about how Levy County's coast has already changed. We've seen a bunch of changes already in the past, and we'll see some more in the future. And then we're going to talk about where we are today in our planning process and where we're headed in the future. And then what does this mean for me? What does this mean as a conservationist? What does this mean as a business owner or as a resident? So what is coastal change? It's something you all may be familiar with, and it's something you may or may not necessarily think about until you have seen it firsthand. So we have several different types. The first is sudden change, which is hurricanes and floods are the most obvious types. They can alter the coastline and cause damage to coastal structures and to habitats and environments that are right on the coast. And then there's intermediate change, which is saltwater intrusion and coastal erosion. And y'all have probably seen saltwater intrusion into the potable water system. So we know these changes are definitely happening. And then there's slow change, which is sea level rise, which is kind of one of the big overarching things that we're here to talk about today. Sea level rise is kind of a common theme here because it can compound intermediate and sudden changes. So for example, if you have a hurricane come through and you know the storm surge is going to come up to a certain height, if you have sea level rise, it's going to cause that storm surge to go even higher and further inland. And in a relatively low area like Levy County, that could be a big issue. So on the topic of changes, let's talk about coastlines. Coastlines are dynamic. They are always in constant state of change. So since the last glacial period, which was about 18,000 years ago, we've been observing rising sea level. And the trend has been kind of a landward migration of the coastline. It's moving inland. And this has been happening at varying rates. In the last 6,000 years, we've been seeing about 4 to 6 millimeters every year. However, in that 18,000 year period, we've seen levels change as much as 40 millimeters. That's about 1.5 inches. So if you could picture in that 18,000 year period, even just a decade of 40 millimeters a year, that's more than a foot of sea level rise in a short amount of time. Now, it doesn't mean it will happen, but it could. So scientists believe that we're actually moving towards a faster rate of sea level rise, faster than 4 to 6 millimeters. We're heading towards somewhere in the nature of 15 millimeters every year. So this here is the mean sea level trend for right here in Cedar Key. What this map is, or what this graph is these blue lines represent the fluctuating mean sea level, or the average sea level for Cedar Key tide gauge. And as you can see, since this map runs from 1914 to 2006, and in that time, it's been a linear increase. You can see it's definitely going up on average. It's been 1.8 millimeters on average every year since then, which translates to about 0.59 feet, so a little more than half a foot. Which leads us into the Army Corps projections for the future. This blue line represents that fluctuating every year up and down, and then this blue line is a continuation of that linear trend that we saw in the previous graph. So, assuming all just goes as planned, we're looking at by 2060 less than a half a foot of sea level rise. However, the Army Corps predicts that we're going to have an increasing rate of sea level rise. So we're looking more in the range of 9 to 24 inches, which is what this orange area represents. Most of them are leaning closer to 24 rather than 9. So that could be a big deal. So how has the coast already changed? Y'all have probably seen some changes yourself, maybe. The United States Geological Survey, also known as the USGS, has done a study in the Big Bend region where basically they looked at how the coast has changed since the 19th century. Looking at things like historic maps and older aerial images and nautical charts, basically able to come to the conclusion that marshes are on the move. And what that means is that the saltwater marshes are moving inland. There's an inland migration of them, which is leading to coastal forests retreating into the inlet. So if we look at this map here, which we also have another copy of over there, and you guys can check out after we're done with the presentation. Take a look at this orange line, this orangish brownish line. That's the historic coastline in the 1850s. Now in the 1850s, this pink line represents where the upland boundary was at that time. So this whole green shaded area, that's the coastal forest. It used to come to this pink line right here. Now, 150 years later, it's retreated to this dark green line. It's about 1 kilometer on average overall. And that's a lot. All that whole area between the pink and the green is converted to marshes. So that leads us to where we are today and what we're going to do in the future. And Mr. Sean is going to take over.
Thanks, Kevin. So we talked about how things have changed in the past, and we're going to move on to where we are today and future concerns. Both talk a little bit about economic concerns, but more about conservation concerns since this is a conservation organization. So we've talked about changes to the coast. We've already experienced saltwater intrusion in Cedar Key. We've seen changes in coastal habitat. We've also experienced coastal erosion in some of the keys out here like Encina Odie and Seahorse. And during intense storm events, we've already experienced intense flooding. The thing is all of these are going to be further intensified by sea level rise. So if we're going to be making decisions today that are going to affect the future, we probably need to start considering how sea level rise might affect those decisions. So it's a matter of making wise decisions for future investments because we want to just make the best decisions for our community as possible. So we want to start considering economically, what does this mean for capital investments, capital improvements? How are roadways today going to withstand minor changes in sea level? Are they prepared for intense storm surge activities? Are buildings today able to withstand intense storm surge? Will they be able to withstand more frequent flooding? Is future development, should we be directing it to areas that are safer and less hazard prone? What about infrastructure and utilities? Will minor rises in sea level affect how we use the toilet? Will we actually be able to flush the toilet? Because it doesn't take much to back up a central sewer system. That's why they're freaking out in South Florida right now, because they're already having problems. They can't flush their toilets in some areas. And when you can't flush your toilet, people get a little upset. So they're investing about $600 million into fixing that problem right now. So good times in South Florida. But how does that also affect things like tourism? How does it affect things like aquaculture? Is increased salinity? We're already having problems with the oysters right now. I think clams like more salinity. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. But these are things we need to be considering. We need to consider how we might be able to adapt to these things. If we can protect certain areas, or if we can accommodate certain sea level rise and changes in coastal habitat, or if we need to eventually plan locating certain settlements in areas in different places, which kind of segues into environmental concerns. So because coastlines are in a constant state of give and take, where you're in a process of building coastlines with sediment deposition as well as taking them away with coastal erosion, there's kind of, they reach not an equilibrium, but things aren't static, but when you're in a period like we've been in the past 6,000, 8,000 years, change is very slow. But when you start having accelerated change, it causes that balance to be thrown out of whack and create greater stresses in the ecosystem and the habitat. So you have more salinity, you have increased flooding, and that eventually alters the ecosystem, and that causes coastal habitats to migrate at a faster rate than they've already been migrating. So what we're going to see is essentially this trend that we've had in the past of more saltwater marshes replacing coastal forests, but it's going to happen at a more rapid rate. And for planning purposes and for decision making, it's how's that habitat going to migrate, and how can we make decisions to that kind of juggle both the social and ecological needs of an area. So if you look at this picture right here, it's kind of demonstrating the habitat migration process. So you have the regular sea level right here, and everything's doing great. You have crabs and mullet and oysters, and you have your saltwater marshes. They're doing great. And you have rise in sea level. As long as it's not at too fast of a pace, habitat can migrate. And what's not depicted here is if you have rapid acceleration, it'll be much less saltwater marsh than this, because it just can't, things can't migrate that fast. Like it's a slow process, so when you throw things out of balance, it affects that. But as long as you have a not too fast of a rate, it can migrate. But when you have development that impedes it, which isn't too much of a problem here in Levy County, it just drowns out those areas, and things pretty much, you don't have that biodiversity of things going on. So it's something to take into account, especially in low-lying areas where there might be development that could be in conflict with habitat migration. So we're lucky enough to have people that have been researching how habitats have been changing and how they'll forecast how they might change in the future in Levy County, specifically in the Waxahachie Bay and in the Withlacoochee Gulf Reserve. So we've had people that have been taking actual field plot data, going out in the field and going into tree stands and coastal hammocks and measuring how fast they've been changing and how fast they've been retreating. And they use that to kind of put into this thing called SLAM. It's Sea Level Affecting Marshes model. And that models how habitats migrate. And they use it to kind of hindcast. So they set it up to make sure that their model, when they're forecasting in the future, can accurately predict how it changed in the past. And what they did here is they set up a scenario where they had 1 meter or 3 feet of sea level rise, and they modeled it in the Waxahachie Bay. And all this area in the green here, what they highlighted in this image is where coastal forest transitioned into marsh. So all this area is currently right now coastal forests and uplands, and with 3 feet of sea level rise, it transitions into marsh. And that's pretty profound, especially we'll see in a couple images later. That pretty much encompasses most of the existing Waxahachie State Park right now as it stands today. So we have to start thinking, do we want to conserve other areas that are outside of park boundaries, or is it okay to just let these things go and happen as natural processes occur? So you know, like I said, it's the same story as the past. We have the future is predicting more rapid transitions than have already occurred. And what happens is it's not just that sea level rise kills everything and makes things change, makes things transition. It's that just the chronic stress from the increased salinity in that environment. When you have periodic disturbances like intense drought or intense storm event from like a hurricane, it just makes those areas less resilient and they can't handle that. And as you'll see in the next picture, things begin to die on the edges and the coastal forests retreat, hammocks go away, new hammocks are formed further inland. It's that same story. And another thing worth noting is we're seeing an increasing presence of mangroves in Levy County. Levy County is kind of right at that ecotone, so that's that transition between saltwater marsh and mangrove forest. And in the past couple decades, we've seen an increasing prevalence of mangroves. That I know just in the time that I've lived here, I'm from Ocala, and I've been coming out to Levy County since I was a little baby and coming fishing. There's just more mangroves than I can remember. Just today, driving in today, I was like, God, I don't remember there being this many mangroves. But yeah, so that's one thing. That's another change to consider. But here is the Withlacoochee Gulf Preserve, and if you look right here in this right corner, that's where coastal forest has already pretty much died and is in the process of transitioning into saltwater marsh. And if you look on the periphery of all these, you can see where that transition is also occurring. And it's slow, but the take-home point is that our coastal habitats are changing, and we can see these changes already happening today. And it's only going to become more apparent in the future. So, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for our organization? What does this mean for residents and people that care about conservation? So what happens is, if you look along here, you can see a lot of Levy County's coastline is already in conservation. And what happens, and this image right here is just a half a meter, so it's 1.5 feet of sea level rise. And significant portions of the Waxahachie State Park are potentially going to be lost, and up here in this National Wildlife Refuge, and that's just 1.5 feet. Like that's well within projections in the next by 2060. So what does that mean for decision making? Look at, this is pretty intense, and right here is a low area that we already saw a lot of change in the past. It's only going to change more, and that might convert more to open water. We don't know. So what does this mean for migrating coastal habitats and human development? They might be competing for the same land in the future. So what this really translates into is we need to take into account how future sea level rise might impact conservation, land planning, and management decisions. We probably need to plan ahead so that we can avoid land use conflicts, so that we can better prioritize land allocation and future conservation efforts. So think about areas that we think are worth protecting, and not focusing on areas that we might be trying to protect today that might not be there in the next 50 years. So it also comes down to maintaining ecological corridors, and if necessary, adapting those corridors to future sea level rise scenarios. And then it comes down to making informed decisions on both conservation investments and capital investments and improvements in different areas. So it's just about incorporating sea level rise and coastal change into the decision-making process so that we're addressing potential problems that may arise in the future. So we'd like to open the floor up to discussion, but before we do that, I just want to point out this picture. This is from a thesis that a University of Florida master's student did in URP, Urban Regional Planning, and he analyzed changes in Encina Otikee, and this is from 1961 and 2001, and you can, just in 40 years, you can see some pretty significant changes just to the key. Like, you look over here, this is transitioning into open water pretty much, and it used to be actual forest. And it's just another image of showing how things have changed in the past. So it's not something that's new to this area. This area is used to change. It's just how do we adjust and adapt to it for the future so that we can be a prosperous and healthy community and make sure that people are safe and we make wise decisions. So I'd like to open the floor up to discussion and ask you, have you noticed any changes along the coast? what's important to you, what's worth protecting, and what additional information would be helpful? What type of scenarios would you be comfortable with planning for? So we'll go back to the first question. Any changes that you've noticed along the way?
I noticed that that's Seahorse Key.
Is that Seahorse?
Yeah,
Let's see.
Oh,
that's got the lighthouse on it.
yeah, okay. Yeah, that's what you had it marked as, sorry.
Oh, yeah, no, just so you could change it.
Yeah, we'll get it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So what did you do? So yeah, has anybody here noticed any changes along the coast?
Lots of erosion.
Yeah?
In particular areas?
Yeah, up by Piney Point where we live, there's a peninsula that goes by that's gotten narrower in the last 3 or 4 years. Some of it's been quick because of tropical storms, but I think also, once the tropical storm comes in and the regular tide goes back and forth, there's a lot of erosion out there.
And that's at, where'd you say this?
Piney
Piney
Point?
Point?
Yeah.
Okay.
That, what he's talking about is that it was a dredged area that's just, it's going back to its natural state.
Oh, it's not, then you're not continuing to dredge it, okay. So you've got sediment building back up.
And
No, I'm
the
talking
beach
about
is
the
shifting-
outside.
Yeah, the beach is shifting back where,
Okay.
where it's closer.
You
So
can see,
some of it's almost gone, Rob, on one end, I mean,
you can see it on there.
on one
look at
end,
Well, that's because the pigeons.
on that peninsula.
Right, that's because the pigeons are wasn't there,
Oh, okay.
and was added.
Okay. What else have you noticed?
Well, the mangroves, in his lifetime, have made a huge rebound, but they're not as big now as the stumps that you still find, so that's just a cycle. But one thing that is interesting is I'm gonna take Pat out and take a picture of it and show it to Dr. Earl, but there are other types of species of mangroves here, the better ones, the good ones for fish. And there was
Red
one on-
mangroves?
Redmonds.
The red ones?
Yeah, there was one on North Key and it died, and it made it, it started through the summer and then it died in the winter. Now there's 2 on Seniota, and that's the ones they're about 2 years old, and but the mangroves actually from what we hear in the report of the writings in the 20s and 30s, the mangroves from here to the mouth to Black Point, which is just south of Shell Mound, was kind of like a river. They were so big, and the stumps are there. I mean, there's evidence of that, and they're big stumps.
Were those red mangroves or the
No, they're black.
mangroves? Yeah.
So they're the ones we got that are
Black.
predominant.
The black ones,
yeah.
okay.
And they died in the early '60s. Was there a freeze in the early '60s?
Well, those freezes in the 80s also killed them here.
Well, that killed them again,
Yeah.
and now they've made it back. That was the last big kill.
They come back mighty aggressively. Our trail used to have views.
Right.
Now we have mangrove forest.
Right. And all of, people needed wood back in the early days, and all of our photographs show a tremendous amount more vegetation today than we've had in previous times, because we don't need firewood.
Yeah.
Somebody brings it to you in a pickup truck now. So it's different. Like the '61 photograph there, if you had that of Cedar Key, you'd have a much whiter Cedar Key than you have today. So a lot of our habits have changed. That who knows what's making these coastlines change? Like Mr. Jerry was talking about with the dredging.
Anybody else? Go ahead, John.
When I first got here, I was walking my dog on Rains Beach over there, and it seemed to be a really nice white sandy beach. And just over the 2 or 3 years that I was walking my dog, since I moved here, all the white sand seems to be gone. It's all pushed back, and now where there was white sand, it seems to be brown mud along there mainly, rather than the sand that we were walking on before. And I know I guess I haven't been there very recently, but the stairs down to there are now a couple of feet up above the sand and that all, I don't know why, but that all seemed to happen just within a couple of years of me going Denver.
Didn't Bill DeLeo put a seawall there though? Because he's having trouble with the seagrass.
Right, he keeps battling it, so
Yeah.
that may have something to do with it.
Yeah.
It seemed to disappear awfully quick.
You see, well, that will change it quickly when you put in a bulkhead like that.
That whole area, they slowly but surely have turned it into one big wall.
Mm-hmm.
And despite building, city codes to say not to, and John's right, as a result, I mean, because there's nothing else that can explain it, that whole beach is basically gone. I mean, really, it's just moved. And you can find it, it's all down there at the end.
It's at the very point.
Just go to Goose Cove, and there's a big old nice white pile of sand,
Yeah.
that used to not be there.
It happened fast, though, for sure.
So what kind of information would be helpful to you as you move forward and make decisions either about where you live or what your business is or for the conservation issues? What can we provide to you? Because you saw just a sampling up here of the maps that we have. We have hundreds of maps and data and one of the things we want to know is what can we provide to you? What would be helpful? Go ahead.
I think one of the things USGS is doing is the LiDAR studies of the coastline of the Gulf of Mexico, et cetera, and I think it's a 20-mile from coast to inland swath that they're studying. And I'm wondering if that could be approached or addressed in this so that individual homeowners or landowners may have some idea if their pine forest is going to be marsh, their estate or ranch is going to be marsh, and that would give people time to adjust and government to address the issue. I think the population, if I'm not mistaken, may not be as worried about coastal marshes becoming more marsh, but private property owners may be more interested in an effect that may have on them.
Sean, can you speak more about the LiDAR data? I'm not sure if that's something, or Kevin, is
Well,
that something y'all have worked on?
I know that they were doing LiDAR for emergency evacuation routes, like Department of Emergency Management. They did LiDAR.
Yeah, there's LiDAR that basically evaluates the elevation of the land. That was what it was used for, to determine if certain evacuation routes would be underwater at certain flooding levels after a hurricane.
Yeah,
That was more what it was
where the
used for.
LiDAR exists, you can tell if there's a low elevation, it's going to be more vulnerable to certain changes in sea level. So, yeah.
One of the things that we've been struggling with in terms of the overall project is to avoid implying that we can tell you if your lot is susceptible to change in some specific period of time. So if you look at some of the maps that Sean and Kevin were showing you, or some of the maps that we have up here, you'll see that they're a little more generalized. And you can go up and figure out where you live, but we're trying not to imply that our data has a level of accuracy that it does not yet have. Because that's an alarmist kind of thing to say, this road, this lot will be flooded or will be underwater, because we don't have it at that level of detail. So that's a struggle in terms of giving you what you need, but not going too far.
Yeah, because what we show, it's more it's a general account of vulnerability than certainty in what's going to be inundated. It's a lot of it's based on elevation. So if an area is lower and it's by the coast, it's more vulnerable to different impacts. There's a lot of things that go into it, especially things like the general soil structure and soil, what that composition is. It affects how things drain. Areas like Cedar Key that are developed, they're easier to protect. So you can create bulkheads, but in the end, it's how you invest in protection, because some protection efforts aren't very sustainable. Like it's not really a big deal here, but in other places where they have white sand beaches, like beach nourishment, the cost of maintaining that becomes too much to actually maintain it, and you can bankrupt a city doing beach about weighing your decisions and your options. Do you want to do things that accommodate future changes? You can take no regrets type of decisions. So it's a decision that basically it builds your capacity to be safer and more resilient, but the turnaround is it's not, you're not really wasting any money. What's the worst that happens if sea levels don't accelerate fast enough? You have a safer community that's more able to withstand hurricanes if you set buildings minimum size of a foot higher than they are today. There are little changes you can do. Changing your infrastructure, adjusting roadways like DOT, a lot of areas, especially in North Carolina, even though they just had they're not allowed to plan for sea level rise for 3 years until they decide whether they want to do linear trends or not. I was listening to a guy from North Carolina DOT talking about how they're planning for roadways there, and they're very serious about planning for roadways because what happens with roadways, it's not so much overwash that's the problem, it's what's going on under them. So if their beds they start having more water underneath them, it washes out the foundation and the roads fail. So it's about making sound investments for your community. You don't want to just invest in something that you're expecting to be there for 100 years and it's going to be gone in 50 type of deal. So we're trying to get people engaged in a conversation to start accounting for those types of things.
What about the idea of expanding the area where conservation lands are purchased and held by the public? Because existing conservation lands may become open water or marsh rather than coastal hammock. But do you all have an opinion on that?
In this county, we've done that. The line that you have there is fee simple state ownership. The line of protection is double that into that
For
area,
the,
into, it's private property.
Right.
It's a,
but they put conservation easements on it? So we should map the conservation easements to add to that.
Well, no, but it'd give you a clearer picture of
Right.
how much more and that's pretty heavy protection. It's hardwood protection. It's water rights. Well, not water rights. There's no such thing as hardwood development rights. Is what I'm saying.
Right, okay.
But it's pretty. They're able to continue to do the timber operations that were already currently in pine cycles.
Right, and that's around the state park?
Yeah, it's mostly Plum Creek land. Isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Okay.
Have you done anything on refraction studies
Sean, do you know about that?
with,
I'm not aware of it, so.
with some of the bigger storms and looking at what direction and what the refraction, the effect on the land?
I don't think that our resource base right now has that information in it, so we'll look at that. I mean, I'll find out if that's been done and it's just not part of our database.
It would make quite a difference.
Okay,
Y'all know what he's talking about.
that's not something I'm not a scientist, so I'm
Well,
not very familiar with
I
that.
think it's a theory, but I sure would like for it to not be a theory.
Okay,
And the theory is that for every mile of marshland, it absorbs 1 inch or 1 foot of category
right,
something hurricane.
right,
And they learned more of it about being Katrina than anything else because there was less damage in the undisturbed areas than there were the developed dredged areas.
right. I'm familiar with that.
And it would be, that's, the commission learned a little bit about it after Katrina, and that's when they got real hard on their seawall laws in Cedar Key
Right,
as a result of it. So it doesn't have really a lot to do with sea level rise, but when you fly in a plane over the coast, you can clearly see where these hurricanes have made landfall. There's a difference. Like your red, see how out below the Waukesha State Park where it's written, you come down and all of a sudden, there's a change in the red, there's higher ground.
right,
That might be a path for hurricane that changed that.
right,
And so, even though you're dealing with sea level rise, if you knew how those refractions worked and how they ultimately may change as something that we do,
Right.
then then it's gonna affect the sea level rise long term.
Well, and as Sean was saying, as sea level rises and the marshes become open water and the coastal hammocks become marshes and so on, that's gonna change the absorption.
Right.
The coastline can't, the degree to which the coastline can absorb those, storms.
Exactly.
So, okay. What else can we, what other information would you like to have?
There are things we can do to help preserve our coastline.
Strategies, yes. We were here, 2 weeks ago, a week ago, I forget what day, we were here now, and the discussion was, well, can we stop it?
Well, I know we went to something,
Basically, no.
we went to something, what, that building the University of Florida has, that, talked about what to do to your. Yeah, what is that
Oh.
building called?
The lab.
Yeah, we went there a few years ago, they had a thing on Save Your Coastline, and they talked to us about what we could plant, not to put up a seawall, you know,
Right.
that would hold the soil in a storm.
Right.
Yeah, there's been some research on living shorelines as protection options. That's more of an accommodation strategy than a protection strategy because you're still accommodating these processes.